In 2010, I was living in Quincy, with my husband, new baby, and a roommate. It was a Saturday, so I was taking a much-needed break from the baby and went to run errands and have some alone time. My first stop was to the local Radio Shack to get a phone accessory. After my purchase, I walked out of Radio Shack deep in thought about my to-do list, when a voice broke through my reverie. "Excuse me, miss, can you help me, please?" I blinked in confusion and looked over at the man who addressed me. My first impression was Italian grandpa. Everything about him, from his khaki slacks, brown cardigan, and tweed flat cap, to his sandy-colored mustache. Even the car he stood next to. A boat-sized town car, was a faded champagne. I hesitated. As a big believer in the golden rule, I generally try to help people out whenever I can, but this time something about the situation gave me pause. I stood there in the middle of the parking lot. "What do you need?" I asked. He smiled warmly. "There's something wrong with my car." He held up a key. "When I click my car key, my car door locks won't lock. It's very strange. Can you come over and take a look?" He gestured to his car. Still hesitating, I answered, "I don't know anything about cars, but we're right here at Radio Shack. Maybe they can help you," he said. "I think we can figure this out together. Come here and look." Again, I repeated that I don't think I could help him. I could see that he was getting nervous, yet he continued to smile. He walked over the back of his car and opened the trunk. "But here's the strangest thing. The doors won't lock, but the trunk will," he said and started waving at me eagerly. "Come here and look at the trunk." I began to feel very confused. Part of me wanted to go over to help, yet greater instincts prevailed. I began to walk in the opposite direction to my car, repeating over and over again to the man, "I can't help him. Go into Radio Shack for help." As I walked away, I saw him throw up his arms in disgust, slam down the trunk, get in his car, and drive away. I drove on to my next errand, feeling very unsettled. But as I tried to process the encounter, I began to have doubts about my reaction. Maybe he was just an old man who needed help. When I returned home, I shared my encounter with my husband and roommate. I expected that they'd laugh and assure me I was being overly paranoid. Instead, they looked at me with wide eyes. My husband said, "That guy was trying to kidnap me." I didn't report this incident to the police, as I didn't have any useful information regarding a license plate number, and I didn't think a man asking for help with his car counted as harassment. I decided to Google attempted kidnappings in Quincy, in hope that my search would turn up empty, and this was truly an innocent, awkward encounter. When the article pulled up, "Quincy man accused of attempting to kidnap woman," I immediately recognized the perpetrator as the man from the Radio Shack parking lot. A follow-up article revealed that he actually lived in my old neighborhood. I often wonder if I was one of his first attempts at kidnapping, and what would have happened to me if I had gone over to look in his trunk. Almost a year ago, I was an opener at a resort, clocking in before 5 a.m. each day. The resort is located inside of a very wealthy town or suburb. Employees had to park in one of two parking lots at either end of the property, and the lot I chose was adjacent to a long and windy road outside the resort, which led to the rest of the neighborhood. The road and resort were separated by a short range of brush and trees that no one ever walked through. I'd arrived one morning per usual, and put the car into park with my headlights still on. The lights in the lot weren't ever on in the morning, since no one else really showed up before 6 a.m. when the sun was out. So it was usually always dark at the start of my walk. Save for security, I was one of the first employees to arrive on the property each morning, and was usually completely alone in this particular parking lot at this time. This morning didn't seem any different. I had my hand literally at my keys, my brain in the process to turn off my car, when I noticed a young girl, maybe like 14 or 15 years old. Come scampering, her body language was the exact definition. Run with quick light steps, especially through fear or excitement, through the span of trees that separates the resort from the outside road. She was directly in front of my car, and my headlights illuminated a clear view of her in the pitch black. She looked like she was in high school, had long blonde hair, and was wearing a jacket with pajamas maybe, like she just walked out of a house. One thing about her that bothered me was that she wouldn't stop laughing and smiling. I couldn't hear her laughing from outside the car, but she was visually giggling at something I wasn't aware of or could see, and it was so unnatural. She occasionally glanced behind her as if someone else were there, wading away from the headlights. She then waved at me like it were a normal gesture at this time, and then immediately ran to my passenger side door. This all happened in a matter of seconds, and I wasn't really sure what was even happening besides my anxiety spiking. I know I simultaneously yanked the audio jack from my phone to shut whatever song had been playing off while grabbing for the lock button. I remember feeling panic for never remembering if it's up or down to lock, when the girl began pulling violently on the door handle on the passenger side. I realized because I didn't turn my car off, it had stayed locked. She began pounding on the window and I was screaming at the top of my lungs for her to leave before pressing on my horn. I could see her laughing outside like this were some type of game, as if I were a silly friend not letting her in as a joke. After a few seconds, she stopped the pounding and trying to open my car door. Her face fell flat like I disappointed her, and she started to walk away from my car back the way she came. She waved at me again before squeezing through the trees, out of the view of my headlights. I'll never get out of my brain though, how off the feeling was watching a stranger, seemingly alone, pop out from the trees in the darkness laughing, and then try to violently enter my car in an empty parking lot. I do think the possibility of someone else being present the whole time is a lot more scary, and I wonder who else was there and where exactly. It was a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent, and I was a mom in my early 30s who had just driven our kids to the pediatrician. The Macon, Georgia doctor's office was an hour away from our home, and I was just taking the two youngest of my three to our scheduled appointment. Because we lived so far away, their office always gave us the last two appointments of the day, and we were grateful. The doctor had just built a new building, of a fresh spur of the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and finally exited back outside. Mine was the only car left in the lot as I loaded the children in their car seats for our trip home. But as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car somehow wouldn't start when I turned the key. There was just an odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the door until someone allowed us back in and asked to borrow their phone to call a nearby garage for service. Soon we watched as all the lights were turned out in the building again, and everyone left, their cars departing one by one from behind the building somewhere, leaving us now completely alone in the parking lot. Although the service station attendant said that it was probably going to be quite a while, I was pleasantly surprised when a truck pulled into the empty parking lot pretty soon, and a man got out of his pickup, smiled and nodded to me and said he was going to raise the hood. He was middle-aged and a bit dirty, but quite frankly, many gas station attendants sometimes looked that way, especially at the end of the day, and I was grateful when he began doing something under the hood almost immediately. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what he thought was wrong, and he said, "It's just a loose wire, not the battery." I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through that long horizontal slit between the windshield and the raised hood as we waited. More than once, he said that it was merely a loose wire, and if I would just come up here really quick, he would show me which one it was, so it would never happen again. I just thanked him and continued to stay in the driver's seat. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into that desolate parking lot, and as it did, this nice guy working underneath my hood suddenly slammed it shut, ran to his truck, started it, and drove away very quickly, without even saying a word of goodbye. I was both confused and a little anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was now arriving. I even remember feeling a little frightened that he had suddenly left me there alone, with two little ones defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay and speak to whoever was parking next to me now? It certainly seemed the gentleman thing to do. I looked around and was very aware once again that there were no visible cars on the road, no homes or businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set quickly. As this new, also unmarked pickup pulled in next to me, I got out of the car once again. Upon exiting, he immediately introduced himself and his name, and voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone much earlier. He then actually called me by name, apologized for being so late, and finally smiled and stared towards the road, pointing and asking who the man was that had just left so suddenly. Relieved and unfazed, I just smiled back in surprise and told him, "Well, I don't know. I thought all this time he was you." And we both laughed slightly as he then grabbed jumper cables, walked to the front of my car, raised the hood, and started to work. I had my back completely turned towards the children when he surprised me by suddenly coming to the driver's side door. In the strangest voice he said, "Is this yours?" And when I looked into his hands, he was holding a long, thin, dagger-like looking device that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered with reddish rust, yet on one end it had tiny circular small finger holes, as if it was a mix of a long, thin sword and scissors oddly combined. I remember being amazed but not frightened, and I asked where he had found them. "Under the hood," he replied. I had never seen them before. With both of our vehicles running, he came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, irritated me a bit by walking right past me and picking up that weird object once more. He said slowly, "I want you to look at these, one more time," and held them out for closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer and actually really looked. In his hands, the item still appeared incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet-looking quality except for the strangely small 2 loops on one end. I'd never seen anything like it, and told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly and slowly to me. These weren't hidden somewhere in the engine. They hadn't been there very long at all, because they were sitting right on top. They must have just been put there. I shook my head no and half smiled as I said, "But they're obviously very old and rusty," to which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yes, but see how sharp they are. These look like they've just been sharpened." And when I looked down, he was right. The long, skinny, dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip where the rust had been removed were gleaming silver. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, told me that I probably needed to call the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted the item. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to take it at all, but I released the back window so he could place it inside. I did indeed contact the Macon police the moment that we arrived home, and I got the children inside safely. But although they listened politely, they declined when I offered to bring the scissor-like thing to them later. The officer I spoke to said that they sounded as if they were specialized surgical shears, from my description and measurements on the phone, which I found quite disturbing. Around that time, if you look through old news reports, women were going missing all over Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing to this very day.